My name is Eileen Umbehr, and on June 1st, I received an email from CBS 48 Hours informing my husband and myself that they were planning to produce another episode about the Dana Chandler case and the murders of Michael Sisco and Karen Harkness. They were asking us if we would be willing to participate in this episode to talk about the complaint my husband filed against Jackie Spradling, her recent disbarment, and other information about the case that has occurred since they did their first episode. So I sent them a letter back, and I just wanted to talk about my response and my reasons, our reasons for declining to participate in their next episode. First of all, I wrote to CBS 48 Hours back in 2008 to tell them that I had information about an alternate suspect, a member of the family who stood to benefit financially from Karen's death, and that I would be willing to go on camera or talk to them about the information that I possessed. I never heard anything from them, so I sent another letter a couple months later. This time I gave them the name of the alternate suspect, someone we believed who was capable of committing the crime, who had a history of violence, including 2 prior arrests and expertise with weapons, and who had been sanctioned by the Kansas Supreme Court for a double billing scheme. And this was Karen's son-in-law, Jeff Sutton. Jeff had married Karen's daughter, Erin, just 9 months before the murders. Now, it's a terrible thing to accuse anybody of such a heinous crime, and I'm not here to say that I know who killed Mike and Karen, because I don't. But I believe Dana Chandler was wrongfully convicted by an unethical prosecutor, and I think that the information that has come out since her conviction backs that up. The Kansas Supreme Court unanimously reversed Dana Chandler's convictions due to prosecutorial misconduct on the part of Jackie Spradling, and they have since disbarred Jackie Spradling because of her misconduct in the Dana Chandler case. Notwithstanding, current Shawnee County DA Mike Kage has chosen to retry this case, a case that Justice Biles described as having 80-some witnesses and 900 exhibits, and that despite this testimonial and documentary bulk, they relied on limited circumstantial evidence. And he was talking about the first trial. This is a case that went cold for 9 years. 9 years before Dana Chandler was arrested. Under Robert Hecht, it was cold because, in his estimation, there wasn't enough evidence to bring charges against Dana Chandler. And I applaud him for that. But Chad Taylor got elected, and I believe a lot of pressure was placed on him to bring charges with or without evidence, that the families were convinced, the police were convinced. There's even an article in the Capitol Journal that it's where the title, the headline said, "Cops and Family Lobbied the DA to bring charges against Dana Chandler." That's not how it should work. It should work, the charging decision should be based on sufficient evidence, which is why I'm especially appalled that Mike Kage has chosen to retry Dana Chandler when there wasn't enough evidence to try her in the first place. So, getting back to CBS 48 Hours, when I didn't get a response back in 2008, when I learned that they were planning to do their first show, I went ahead and called them, and I was put in touch with one of the producers, a field producer by the name of Sara Ely Hulse. So we had a phone conversation. I told her some of the highlights of what we knew about Jeff Sutton's past, and she seemed interested in learning more about him and appreciated my call. Then I informed her that I had put together a spiral-bound booklet. I refer to it as a compilation of information. It's not my original work. It's simply newspaper articles about Jeff Sutton's arrests for throwing a man through a plate glass window in a bar fight, for assaulting a highway worker who he was upset with because she wouldn't allow him to bypass the pilot car, and he threw a pop bottle at her hard enough to damage her ribs. Of course, his workers' compensation ended up paying damages to her, and he was ordered to take mental health counseling, and what was given a diversion, and went on his way. Later, he became a county attorney in our county, and my husband filed a formal complaint against him for a variety of allegations, including that he double billed our county for reimbursement for some out-of-pocket expenses for a conference he attended, when he received double reimbursement from a Prosecutors Association fund. So he was sanctioned by the Kansas Supreme Court as a result of that complaint and received a published censure. So that's available online. So this is all, public information about Jeff Sutton. I've always said that I don't know who killed Mike and Karen, but I've never said anything about Jeff Sutton that I can't back up with factual documentation. And this is why I reached out to CBS 48 Hours, so that they would have factual information about a member of the family who stood to benefit from Karen's death and who had access to the home, and which would explain why there was no sign of forced entry. So again, Sara Ely Hulse seemed interested in learning about this information, and so I emailed her. I saved all the emails, and when I wrote back to them this month, I shared those with them and in my response, as well as a copy of the USPS tracking number showing that I had also sent her a hard copy. So I was especially dismayed when the first episode of CBS 48 Hours aired, and they never mentioned a word about Jeff Sutton. In fact, it was basically a hit piece on Dana Chandler, in my opinion. I mean, this woman had not even been arrested when this show aired, and yet they put it up on the screen that Dana Chandler is the one and only person who had the means, motive, and opportunity to commit this crime. And I'm thinking, what? I mean, I knew they knew better because I sent the information. I talked to the field producer. They had information about the son-in-law. So I'm not telling them how to do their show, but if you're going to do an episode about the unsolved murders of Michael Sisco and Karen Harkness, you should include the information, the available information, the documented information about both suspects, not just Dana Chandler. In my opinion, CBS 48 Hours convicted Dana Chandler in the court of public opinion 2 years before she was even arrested and 3 years before she was put on trial. Now, 13 years later, they want to do a catch-up episode. 4 years after the Kansas Supreme Court unanimously reversed the convictions due to prosecutorial misconduct. I would say that warranted an update long before now. Everything they're doing is way too late. They didn't have any problem harming Dana before she was tried the first time. They didn't have any problem running an episode telling the public, conveying to the public and their vast audience of viewers that Dana Chandler was the likely suspect, and in fact putting this up on the screen that she was actually the one and only person. Now that was based on a report from a retired homicide detective from New York, Vernon Gebert, but it still was, burned into the minds of the viewers that basically what the police couldn't do in 7 years, CBS 48 Hours had done. In fact, they bragged about it. It's still up on their website to this day. Their summary of their episodes contains a line that says, CBS 48 Hours was the first to name Dana Chandler as the prime suspect. I mean, it's their claim to fame. They're proud of it. It wasn't the police to name Dana Chandler as a prime suspect. It wasn't the DA. No, it was CBS 48 Hours, a TV show. A national TV show named her the prime suspect. And if people are honest, if you ask them how or why they do believe Dana Chandler's guilty, they'll tell you it's because of what they saw on CBS 48 Hours. Things that family members said, family members who are convinced of her guilt, who wanted to see her pay, who knew that in 7 years they hadn't been able to get the DA to bring charges. I feel like they used the TV show to grease the wheels. And lead detective Richard Voley was on the TV show talking about it and promoting this and collaborating with CBS 48 Hours. And then 2 years after the show aired, that's when they charged Dana Chandler with the double murder of her ex-husband Michael Sisco and Karen Harkness. And there's, to this day, no direct evidence linking Dana Chandler to the crime. In fact, she lived 540 miles away. So, getting back to CBS 48 Hours, my reply, I reminded them of this information that I'd given them and that they ignored and left out of their episode. I also explained my dismay over the fact that, according to KBI agent Mark Malik, their first episode, which was so damaging and prejudicial to Dana Chandler, was re-aired periodically at what Mark Malik described as strategic times. Oh, really? Is this how we solve crimes in Topeka, Kansas? Does the KBI work with television shows? Mark Malik stated, and this was in a transcript of a deposition. So it was recorded by a court reporter. So his exact words are in a transcript. And he stated that they worked with the network to re-air the broadcast at strategic times. One of those strategic times was a couple weeks before her arrest. Another strategic time, apparently, according to some comments on CJ Online, the very day of her arrest, July 25th, 2011. There were multiple people on CJ Online that day stating, "How weird is that? That episode is airing right now." That wasn't a coincidence. That was designed. And I've got Mark Malik's own words to prove that. So Dana Chandler has been framed for this murder. And she's been set up and she's been convicted in the court of public opinion. People hated Dana Chandler after that show. They were absolutely convinced by a television show that Dana Chandler was guilty. And so, as I said to the representative at CBS when I wrote back to them, that unfortunately they got caught up in Jackie Spradling's web of lies. They got the scoop, all right, but they got the scoop from an unethical prosecutor who lied so much about what happened in this case that she was disbarred for it. I mean, they don't do that lightly. This warranted disbarment, according to 6 justices of the 7 justices on the Kansas Supreme Court. Justice Evelyn Wilson dissented. But 6 justices agreed that this kind of prosecution, lying to the jury about a criminal defendant, is such an abuse of authority, abuse of the enormous power entrusted with prosecutors. As Caleb Stegall wrote in their decision in State of Kansas v. Eldon Sherman, it is the grossest inequity that can be visited upon a citizen by the state. Abuse of prosecutorial power. He said that this abuse should not be tolerated in a free society. And they further said in State v. Sherman that they reiterated their commitment to punishing actual abuses of prosecutorial power. They're aware that it happens, and they were renewing their commitment to punishing actual abuses. And they stated that prosecutors who knowingly and intentionally disregard the dictates of justice in Kansas courts do so at his or her peril. And I believe this is the first case where we've actually seen peril. And maybe it's the first complaint against a prosecutor since they wrote the decision in Sherman. I don't know. But we have seen the face of peril. And it is not pretty. And I don't rejoice over the demise of Jackie Spradling, but you know what I do rejoice over? I rejoice over justice being done. I rejoice that 6 of the 7 justices of the Kansas Supreme Court meant what they said in State v. Sherman. They meant that there'd be peril. They meant that they believed it was the grossest inequity that could be visited upon the citizens by the state. And it should not be tolerated. And I applaud them because it wasn't tolerated. And thank God. Thank God for that. Thank God we have a justice system that actually cares whether prosecutors tell the truth about the criminal defendants that they are trying for crimes that will put them in prison for a very long time, if not life. Dana was sentenced with 2 50-year sentences, 2 hard 50-year sentences. It's death by incarceration, and there is 0 evidence that she committed this crime. If I were one of the jurors on the Dana Chandler case, I'd be really upset because they have to live with what they did. They were deceived. They were misled on a number of things. The Supreme Court didn't just reverse because of the lie about the protection from abuse order. They said that was enough. But they listed others so they wouldn't be repeated. Yeah. So CBS was proud to break this case wide open. They bragged about it. And they were given the designation of the pool photographer for the trial. So they were there. Apparently Sara Ely Hulse was there, but she never came up to me. I didn't know what she looked like. I mean, there were only a few supporters on Dana's side. Nobody interviewed the family members. Nobody from CBS 48 Hours interviewed anybody from her side of the aisle that I'm aware of. I certainly wasn't in any of their shows. I would have been happy to talk about my belief in Dana Chandler's innocence. I did introduce myself to some producers and to Richard Schlesinger after the sentencing. I offered to give them a copy of the person of interest. But they didn't have anything to say. They told me that Sara Ely Hulse was there, but I never did get to meet her. They weren't interested in telling the other side of the story. They never were. They were quick to do a follow-up episode. In fact, they promoted it as their opening show for their 25th premieres, season. They did little mini promos about how My Dad's Killer, the follow-up show, that it was rare for them to open their season with a sequel, if you will, to one of their other shows. And but that's they promoted it that way, and they were very proud of it. And even the titles are prejudicial to Dana. I've always said, where does Dana Chandler go to get a fair trial? She asked for a change of venue, was denied. She's sitting in jail 4 years after her convictions got reversed on a $1 million bond. I've tried to find the money to help her get out on bond so she can work with her lawyers and breathe fresh air and eat food she likes and be with her loved ones. But no, she gets marched into every hearing in a jail jumpsuit with shackles on her hands and feet. So Dana Chandler continues to pay the price for this for this misconduct, which resulted in a wrongful conviction. So CBS that had no problem running an episode and re-airing that episode multiple times strategically, working with the police, working with the KBI to use that TV show to educate the public about Jackie Spradling's version of events. They got the scoop from a proven liar who's since been disbarred. What are they going to do about that? They haven't done anything so far. But now I learned they are going to do a follow-up show, which I can only presume will include information about these dramatic developments in the case. The reversal, Jackie Spradling's disbarment, the upcoming trial, retrial. But we declined to participate in that because of their history and their shameful reporting of this case and their one-sided version of events. I think they were so excited to be on the inside, to get the scoop from the DA's office, and I think they knew what side their bread was buttered on, that's just my opinion, that if they had included Jeff Sutton in the story, then Jackie Spradling and Chad Taylor would have stopped talking to them. I mean, the whole purpose of working with CBS, I can only assume, was to get out the information about Dana Chandler, to vilify her, to demonize her, to get the world to hate her, to convict her in the court of public opinion, which presumably would make it a lot easier to convict her in the real court of law. And then, you know, I have a problem with Judge Parrish granting them the pool photography designation. I mean, this is a TV show that has already aired an episode making Dana look like the likely suspect. How is that a neutral news organization? I mean, it was like a continuum of the show. Like, you all saw the show, and now here they're back to film the actual trial and then to do their follow-up show, and that's exactly what happened. But when the tables turned and this case went a different direction, and it wasn't Dana Chandler guilty anymore, it was Jackie Spradling guilty, and Dana Chandler's convictions reversed because of her misconduct. But they didn't see fit to do a follow-up episode after that. So there's nothing about CBS that has been fair with Dana Chandler. So we are not going to participate in any follow-up show. So the other thing that I pointed out to CBS in my response was the fact that Judge Robert Fairchild considered a request for a search warrant, which my husband submitted, based on everything we know about Jeff Sutton. He produced a probable cause affidavit asking the judge to grant a search warrant for Jeff Sutton's DNA. The judge read it and found there was probable cause to justify collecting buccal swabs from Jeff Sutton to be compared to the DNA samples from the hair collected from the scene of the murders. And that's a whole nother story, but I do hold CBS accountable for not informing their viewers of any of this. Not the reversal, not the fact that, 3 years ago, the Judge Fairchild found probable cause that an alternate suspect, the son-in-law of Karen, Jeff Sutton, may have committed this crime. I mean, it's a serious thing to grant a search warrant for somebody's DNA. But he read the affidavit and agreed there was probable cause here to warrant that, to justify that. And we have that. But I don't believe we have all the DNA results from the tests that were conducted by the FBI in Quantico. So that's why I continue to maintain that they need to compare all of the test results to Jeff Sutton. Jackie Spradling submitted some sample, or the Topeka Police Department, Jason Detch, to the FBI 2 months before the trial. And it was a slide with debris. We do not believe it was the single hair on the shell casing, which many of you know and are aware. That one single hair was found on a shell casing. And that was sent in to the FBI. But when it was sent in is another question. Because why would they, in a case that had gone cold for 9 years, wait until 2 months before the trial to submit that hair for testing to see whether it matched Dana Chandler? And it didn't. None of the DNA matched Dana Chandler. In fact, in the probable cause affidavit submitted to Judge Richard Anderson for Dana Chandler's arrest on July 22nd, 2011, is the date that they presented that to Judge Anderson, there was a line in there that said, we may want to add to or remove this line as the DNA did not match Chandler's DNA or hair. Okay, so where are those results? Have they been compared to Jeff Sutton? Because we now have Jeff Sutton's DNA. It wasn't a match to the sample they sent in 2 months before trial. But what about the pre-arrest DNA tests that were done? Were there no tests done? There were. Mike Kagay has an obligation to thoroughly investigate alternate suspects for the first time. Do what they've never done. Do what's never been done, and that's compare all the DNA to Jeff Sutton. Before you retry Dana a second time, you need to investigate Jeff Sutton thoroughly the first time. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say today, and I guess we'll see when this CBS 48 Hours episode airs and what it includes. And meanwhile, the retrial for Dana Chandler is scheduled for August 1st. It's expected to last 3 weeks. I call upon Mike Kagay to dismiss the charges against Dana Chandler due to a lack of evidence. He has a dual responsibility as a prosecutor to not prosecute a case where there is insufficient evidence and there is no probable cause to believe that this individual committed the crime. And with all the lies that were told about Dana Chandler in order to gain that first conviction, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if they had any real evidence against Dana Chandler, we would have heard about that by now. We would have heard about that in the first trial, but we didn't. That's why they resorted to lying. That's why Chad Taylor got up in court and put on a hat, stocking hat, and gloves, and surmised that perhaps the reason that there was none of Dana's DNA at the crime scene could have been because of just simple household items, such as a hat and gloves. It would be so simple to not leave any of your hair or DNA. Just put on a hat. Was there proof that she wore a hat and gloves? Was her hat and gloves found at the scene with her DNA on it? And that would be some evidence, wouldn't it? No. It's just pure speculation. Speculation that how did she end up in Loveland, Colorado at Walmart the day after the murders? Well, they figure she must have gone through Nebraska. Justice Files said that's pure speculation. He said you might as well have said she went to Oklahoma. He said anybody in law school knows you don't go there. And I loved what Justice Carol Byer said when she talked about the protection from abuse order. And Jody Litvin tried to defend it and make excuses for Jackie Spradling's lie. And Carol Byer said it gave the imprimatur of the court to Dana Chandler's dangerousness. And that's what makes it so unacceptable. And as Justice Files said, you said something that wasn't true, that might cut a protection from abuse order against Dana Chandler. And then you said that a judge validated the claim and agreed that she was a danger because that would be the foundation for granting a protection from abuse. And then you went so far as to say she ignored it. Imagine a prosecutor lying to this extent, lying to the jury, trying to lie to the Supreme Court justices in oral arguments, lying to them in written briefs about the protection from abuse order, and then lying when you were being investigated for your ethics complaint, and then double back and saying there were 2 PFAs. She had already acknowledged when she was backed into a corner by Justice Johnson, God love him. He said, I'm confused. Is this the 1998 order that you're talking about? And he said, well, you had a 6455 motion right before the trial, and you never said anything about a protection from abuse order. You talked about a request for a restraining order and a case manager, but that's a far cry from an order for protection from abuse. And that's when Jackie Spradling said, well, I don't want to mislead this court. There is no protection from abuse order or protective order. And then after that, she doubles back in a deposition and says, the Supreme Court meant well, but they got it wrong. I mean, Jackie is clearly unfit to be an attorney and to have that kind of power. And yet, because the ethics complaint took nearly 6 years to process, Jackie went on to serve as Bourbon County attorney and then got reelected. I mean, she was appointed and then got elected Bourbon County attorney. So she's the lead prosecutor. I mean, the system has failed. The system has failed in this case, miserably. It is failed Dana Chandler, and it has failed the victims who were given a false sense of justice, who were led to believe that they got the right person, when in fact they only got the conviction against Dana Chandler because they lied about her. They lied about the motive. They manufactured a motive, claimed they knew that Dana just found out Mike was getting married. They'd been divorced for 4 years. Why would that be a surprise to her, that they were finally getting married? They'd been dating for 4 years, and Dana and Mike had been divorced for 4 years. She wasn't stalking them. She lived 500 miles away. You know, they just put pieces of the puzzle together to paint this picture of Dana Chandler as the one and only person, and they used CBS 48 Hours to do it. So 48 Hours in my book, CBS is 13 years late in doing this episode. They're certainly 4 years late in doing an update when there was a major development, when these convictions got unanimously reversed by the Kansas Supreme Court. They didn't see fit to inform their viewers that the show that they had touted and promoted and aired and re-aired had taken a whole new direction. They never felt any moral or journalistic sense of responsibility or obligation to use the same power they used to make Dana look like she was the person who committed the crime. They didn't use that power to inform people that, hey, it's a new day in this case. There's a new development that raises questions about the validity of this conviction. In fact, it's the Supreme Court unanimously reversed these convictions because of Jackie Spradling and Chad Taylor. And yet they kept that to themselves. It wasn't until Jackie Spradling got disbarred that they came back to the surface and decided, oh man, we better do another story on this. I mean, they finally capitulated, and they wanted us to help them. And that we can't do, and that we won't do.